Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today on Central Booking, it's all about mystery, medicine, and murder with the effervescent Maggie Giles. Maggie is the author of Twisted, an audaciously original novel of suspense in which a jewel theft, an unknown but rapidly proliferating drug, and a series of grisly murders share some enigmatic yet undeniable connection. Workaholic detective Ryan Boone and high-end Madam Mel Parker, seeming opposites by virtue of their professions, are on a collision course, each seeking clarity to a truth that eludes them. To say more would be to say too much. Maggie made her debut with The Things We Lost, which was named a 2023 Distinguished Favorite in Women's Fiction by the Independent Press Awards. She developed an interest in writing while backpacking through Europe and dabbled in multiple genres before settling on suspense and thriller. Maggie is a member of the Women's Fiction Writers Association and served as their social media director for nearly a decade. She makes her home in Ontario, Canada, where she works in marketing when she's not writing. Maggie's next release, 2024's Wicked, will be a sequel to Twisted, which internationally best-selling author Samantha M. Bailey praised for its intricate, inventive plot. She further enthused, "This wild, gritty thrill ride will knock you for a loop and blow your mind." Now, join us as Maggie Giles teases the tantalizingly twisted nature of her new thriller. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Central Booking. Today, I am in conversation with Maggie Giles, whose new book, Twisted, is available for your reading pleasure right now. Hi, Maggie. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
I'm so happy to have you here. So I have to say, this is truly an apt title, Twisted. And I also have to say that I read a lot by virtue of what I do, and I can't remember the last time that I read something sort of as original and unique as your book. And I mean that in a very good way, because it's sort of hard to find something that I haven't seen, read, heard about before. And this book was it for me. So I tip my hat to you if I was wearing a hat. But
Thank you.
readers out
Amazing
there,
to
if you're
hear.
looking for something that is not your norm, this is probably the book. I should tell you, we're going to talk in sort of general terms because it would be very, very easy to move into spoiler territory. And obviously, with a book like this, you do not want to do that. But I am going to start with this absolutely fabulous cover because it's brilliant, and I think it might be a talking point for you to at least tease what this book about. Because when I look at it, I see a woman who is fierce, and she looks to be fashionable, and she's obviously seeing life through a lens. And then there's somebody with a mysterious drug, and it's not her, it's somebody else's hand. So using those little snippets, what can you tell us about the premise of this book?
First and foremost, I love that you mentioned the cover. It is close to my heart. I can honestly say I had nothing to do with it. It was fully our amazing cover designer, Nat Mack. I sent her ideas of like what I thought a thriller cover was. It was nothing like this. So she knocked it out of the park, literally brought it home, and we're like, done. That's what we're doing. No changes necessary. So I love that. It's been getting great reception. And, I think that's what speaks so great to the book is that Nat kind of got this idea in her head where she's thinking like, neon lights and back alley deals and all this mystery and mayhem. And that's really what she kind of wanted to put into the cover. And the pill was a huge thing. That was kind of the one term that I had to incorporate because the pill plays such a huge role into the story.
Sure. And I will say, and this is not a spoiler, but there are sort of storylines that eventually come together. And one of the commonalities that we see very early on is that this pill is appearing, in multiple places. And that sort of is a tie-in. But now I will move away from that for a second because I actually wanted to ask you what brought you back to this story? Because if I understand correctly, this is something that you sort of conceptualized way back in 2013 and then put it away for a while, wrote a different book, and now this is your second published novel. And it really is sort of revitalizing something that's been with you for, well, actually a decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's such an interesting thing when it comes to authors is that in so many cases, their first book published isn't the first book that they wrote. And so my debut, The Things We Lost, was probably my seventh book that I wrote. It's very different from Twisted. It's a women's fiction, still has the suspense and mystery to it, but a little bit more of a personal journey story for my main character. Twisted, honestly, when I wrote it all those years ago, I loved it. I just thought it was such a unique story, and all of my readers were just kind of saying the same thing. Super interesting, no idea necessarily what's going on, but really intrigued. And I just was, I honestly like was out there, I was pitching it, and I just kind of, there was something missing from the story. I didn't know what it was, but there was just something missing, and I couldn't pinpoint it after all this work. So when I signed with Rising Action with my debut, shortly after, they're like, what do you want your second novel to be? Like, we should start talking about your career and where you see this going. And I kind of went, I've got, 3 or 4 novels in the drawer if you want to take a look at them. And so I kind of started listing them off, and I mentioned Twisted. And I sort of said to her the same thing. I'm like, I can't really tell you too much about it because I don't really know how to pitch it without giving it away. So you kind of have to trust me.
Right.
And it ended up being great. Like, I will honestly say my best friend can attest to this. She's who I go to with almost all of my imposter musings that I have. While I read through Twisted before I pitched it to Rising Action, I was literally like, this book is garbage. She's gonna hate it. There's the twists are so obvious. Everything is like you can tell everything right away. And my best friend's like, you've read this book how many times? Like, just calm down, send it to her, and wait and see. And I will say, the way the book has come now with the help of my editors, I'm surprised they picked it up when they did, because they really did help me hone it and make it so much better and put that piece in that was missing, 10 years ago.
Sure. It's important to have these best friends, and what a great hook though. Like, if you can hook your, publisher before they release the book, it's kind of brilliant. And speaking of best friends, again, if I understand correctly, it sounds like for some of the characters in this book, you consider them sort of alter egos. And I'm going to say, again, people sometimes say, write what you know, and then we take that very literally, and it's not necessarily a literal thing, but I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about, how you and your characters inform the personas of the people that we meet in these pages here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I talk about this a lot, but I actually have something called aphantasia, which basically means I don't have a mind's eye. So I don't visualize any of my imagination. People find that super weird. I didn't know it was weird until more recently. So for me, I have to use a lot of visual aid when I'm thinking up characters or thinking up settings. So a lot of things with characters, especially, I almost pull from the people I know and the faces I know and, the pictures that surround me. So I think that usually ends up always being a bit of a starting point. Twisted was quite unique because one of my best friends did name 3 of the characters who do still remain in the book, and that's Melanie, Jackie, and Candy, who you meet in the first chapter. And I kept all of those names as per her wishes. And the idea of the alter ego was we're Maggie, Celeste, and Jillian. So she picked these 3 names. I will say right now, off the bat, none of us are like these characters. These characters are very different from us, but the names and a bit of the aesthetic was definitely informed by people I know.
Sure. That's fair. And I'm glad you mentioned aphantasia, because I was not familiar with that term until I did a little bit of research into you. That sounds so creepy. I researched you. But it's so funny because, when you talk about writing, everybody's always like, show, don't tell. And it's like, well, how do you do that if you don't really have a mental image that you can render on the page? So it's interesting to hear somebody with your background coming at a story like that. So thank you for sharing that. And now I am going to ask you about, again, in sort of broad terms, some of the characters in this book, without giving too much away. But, people are probably wondering, why are they, making sure to say these characters are not like you in real life. But really, one of the main characters, her name is Melanie. She goes by Mel, and she has sort of a high-end escort service and some girls that she works for. And I'm just wondering, can you tell us a bit about her background and then what she thinks that her service provides for women that they wouldn't get otherwise? Because I think that this is one of those things that sort of redefines what an escort service might be, and then it becomes sort of empowering for her women versus, something other than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that question. Mel is somebody that I truly learned a lot about as I wrote Twisted. She was actually not the first character I created. I created one of her working girls first, who was Candy, and she was sort of the start of this organization. And I just sort of knew when I started creating Mel's character that I really wanted her to be this very strong and determined person, and particularly for this role that she took on. Um, for her, really, with the service that she provides to these women, and obviously the service they provide to various clients, it was really about kind of this empowering of the role. And you get a little bit of the sense of it when she meets with one of the clients, and she's really been running this very intricate operation, but she's got kind of this bodyguard boyfriend cohort with her Blaine, and she kind of reflects on how nobody would treat Blaine the way that they would treat her, and they, sometimes think she's just another one of the girls and not just, not this person who's really organizing and running this thing. And so I think for her it was really kind of about breaking down those boundaries and having that ownership over, who you are, what you want to do, and kind of taking away some of that stigma.
Sure. And so you mentioned Blaine, and he's an interesting character because, as you said, he's sort of Mel's boyfriend. He's a bodyguard. He takes care of the women who work for her to make sure that they're safe. And he really, provides, I guess, the option for stability for Mel that she really has a hard time, embracing given her past. And I'm wondering, if you can speak to that, and also her character is being maybe believable or relatable or sympathetic, but not always, likable. I know there's that huge argument in publishing about whether characters should be likable or just, you believe who they are. And I mean, she is really a well-intentioned character. I think she has a good heart, but she can also be really abrasive and standoffish and opinionated and stubborn. So it's an interesting mix for a protagonist to have. So can you talk about, those characteristics and how it plays off her dynamic with Blaine and why she won't maybe let him give her all the things that he wants to?
Absolutely. I will preface this and say I love writing unlikable characters. I've written a few that I know people don't always love. But I also find, it's such a broad term because I have some people say none of these characters were worth liking, and I have other people that were just, fall in love. So it's so subjective. I don't mind reading some flaws or some people that maybe have questionable morals, but I totally understand it's not for everyone. I think with Mel, the biggest thing with her and Blaine especially is she has such a complicated romantic past and a complicated past with her mental health that there's just so much issue with trust for her. And although Blaine is amazing, I will preface this, he is amazing. I love him. He's one of my favorite characters I've ever created. He has his own secrets too. And there's a lot that she trusts about him, but there's still some things that he does that makes her kind of question that and question their relationship. So even though he's kind of there and wants to make all these, amazing promises and has this great idea of a life for them, Mel kind of keeps him at arm's length because she knows she can provide for herself. And she's a little wary about putting that trust in someone who, she doesn't know that she can give it all to.
Sure. I think it plays really well, because you don't know how it's going to work out in the end. And we know people like that. Like we, from a distance, can say, no, this person is really, really good for you. And sometimes they're the last person to sort of jump off the brink and fall into that. But I'm wondering too, if you wouldn't mind introducing us to another one of the characters, sort of in the parallel storyline. There's Detective Ryan, I believe it's Ryan Boone. And he's one of those characters where it feels like he could have come off very one note, but he didn't. Like he's incredibly, complex. He has sort of his own tragic history. He has an awkward sense of humor that makes other people uncomfortable, which I love, probably because that's usually me. And, he's sort of work obsessed, and he is a very engaging character as well. And he's sort of running parallel to Mel and Blaine for a lot of the story. So can you tell us about him?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually added Ryan to the story after I had, created the girls and this operation, and really Blaine and kind of everything that was happening with them. I really brought Ryan in because part of it was I need somebody to solve this mystery because no one else is going to. And so he kind of became this really fun character for me to really explore the police procedural, the crime side of things. I will say that in an early draft, he definitely was very bland and he came off very bland. And I have always really loved him, but my amazing editors were like, he's great, but he's missing something. They originally were like, what about dark humor? And like, I am not that good at dark humor. So I was like, what about awkward humor? I'm really good at that. So I just, wanted to try and make him be this very fun, lighthearted character because he deals with so much gruesomeness in his life and in his past, and just his own story is quite sad. So I kind of wanted to give him a little bit something extra to, make me smile at least while I read him.
Oh my gosh. Well, I laughed, and he has a penchant for sort of telling like jokes at crime scenes, and everybody else is just like, no, like you can't say that. But I knew we were going to get along, and it was probably that whole awkward sense of humor thing. I mean, there you
Perfect.
go. So let me ask you this too, again, sort of in general terms, but this book has multiple perspectives and sort of dual storylines that come together in the end. So I'm wondering if you can tell me, what is your process to write a very complex storyline like this? Are you a plotter, a pantser, or a plotzer, which is some combination of the two? Like, how do you keep track of it all?
So I would say now I'm a plotster. Now I am a combination of the two. Now that I've kind of learned how to properly plot out and tell a story, I definitely don't ever plot everything to the letter. I do allow myself a little bit of leeway. I sometimes let my characters just decide what they want to do. That always sounds really funny when you tell that to people that aren't writers, because they're like, aren't you writing them? And I'm like I am, but it's hard to explain. But with Twisted, I will say that I pantsed it completely to start. And it also started with 7 points of view. So it is now 3 points of view. So there was a lot of characters, a lot going on, a lot of stuff to follow, a lot of people to follow. So it was one of those books that I kind of wrote out and was like, this is brilliant. I had a reader go through it, go, okay, it's really interesting, but like no idea what's going on at all. I'm like, I don't mind that, but people that came back and sort of gave me some suggestions on how to tighten it up or make some places where it was a little, make it clearer, where it was a little more confusing. But I will say, when I had an editor challenge me to take it down from 7 to 3, that was when I really went, okay, I have to take a look at this novel and actually like put some plot into it. Like, it had a plot, but it was just, there was so much going on that I think it was almost too chaotic. And I didn't even almost have to like plot it the same way, because I could just be like, oh, that'll work differently in this point of view or in this point of view. And I kind of cheated a little. So now I do work a little harder with plotting. I tend to try and have a beginning, middle, end. I do allow for some pantsing leeway, because I do sometimes find that I get halfway through a novel and I go, oh, light bulb moment, I need to like put this in here and here and here. And I feel like if I were very rigid with my plotting, I would lose some of the fun stuff I do.
Sure. And like you said, sometimes the characters just, take over. You get them started, and then they just run in whatever direction they want to. And I guess, again, for them to be believable, if they're telling you what they're going to do, it would probably make sense to listen. And then all your friends who aren't writers just really wonder what's going on in your head.
You're totally crazy.
And before we move into broader territory, let me just ask you one more question about this book, because something I loved is there's so much, social commentary sort of woven within it. And I don't know if that's conscious or unconscious, probably a bit of both. But, we already talked about the perception of sex workers or high escort service, likable characters who are realistic versus just, fluffy, like Good Time Mary, but she's just cookie cutter or whatever. But what about the drug industry? Because again, not spoilery, but there is, a pill obviously in this book that's showing up and that may be adding to the mysterious elements. And it sort of gets into the question of, are we treating the problem or the person. And I'm wondering if that was something that you consciously, chose to talk a bit about in this book.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. And I will, preface this and say I go into more depth about polydextrin, which is what the medication is called in Wicked, which is the follow-up to Twisted. But that's kind of the basis. The medication, for everyone who hasn't read, it is an anti-anxiety medication used to obviously treat patients with high anxiety, and it is new on the market. So it's something that I kind of wanted to explore a bit. One, around mental health and how a lot of cases we do medication, which is not bad at all. I highly support that, and any sort of mental health care and practice that is needed. But what I think I was really fascinated about, particularly with the pharmaceutical and the drug industry, was a few years ago, we read Dope Sick for my book club, and it talks a lot about the opioid epidemic, essentially, in the US, and how this distribution kind of came about, how people started using it, the payoffs, and all that sort of stuff that was involved. So that was kind of something that's always been floating around in the back of my mind. And so to tie in the pharmaceutical industry a bit and big pharma, that was really where some of that inspiration came in, because I do think it's, something we don't always think too much about, but it's huge industry.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to take you a trip back in time. I want to ask you, what made you decide that books were something you wanted to pursue, and what kept you on the path? Because I think sometimes people don't realize how long it can take to get that first book published. So tell us, how it started for you and how you continue to follow that path until you had a book to hold up now too, to call your own. How do you stay on the path for people who just want to get off?
Persistence, 100%. I am one of those annoying people who will tell you, oh, I've written forever. I'm not kidding. My sister has a book that I typed up for her when she was at camp. It's got artwork and everything in it. I've posted a reel about it if anyone wants to see. It's very brutal. It had a lot of plot holes, but I think I was about 6 years old when I wrote it. And all through high school, I always told stories to my younger cousins when I babysat. I was one of the Harry Potter generation, so I did all my fan fiction, wrote my own Harry Potter fan fiction. I have those on the shelf in here. They will never see the light of day, so please don't ask. And it was just sort of something I'd always enjoyed doing. So when I first sort of sat down to write my real sort of original full-length novel, and I say sort of original because it was original. It was a work of historical fiction about Anne Boleyn, but Anne Boleyn's got a pretty well-known story, so I was pulling some inspiration from some stuff that I knew. So it felt a little less original. It's now much more so. I have edited it. But that was sort of where it started. And I kind of sat down to write this book while my best friend and I were backpacking Europe. We ran out of books to read. So she had encouraged me to write something, and she'd read something. And that was how we were going to pass the time until we had a book drop in another month. And when I came home from that trip, I was really wanted to finish the story. So I kind of just kept writing it. And I ended up having my cousin's grandfather, so on his dad's side, because we're related on his mom's side, is someone who I've known my whole life growing up. And I actually saw him that summer following me writing this historical book. So he put me in contact with another Canadian historical fiction writer who had recently been published, and her name is Genevieve Graham, and she's wonderful. And she actually read a couple of my pages and basically said, oh, here's what you do to get published. And it was a lot of, okay, revise the book, learn how to write, do a query letter, start pitching agents, write a new book, and just, all those things you hear. But it was really the first time I'd ever looked at my work and been like, oh, I could publish this. That's okay, cool. I will say, and I'm preface this right now, that book that I had written was not ready to be published. It was 176,000 words long, which most writers know is like far too long. It is only 100,000 words now. It's been much more condensed, but it was because I didn't know how to write. I never had any formal writing training. I didn't really understand the art of crafting a novel. So I spent a lot of years kind of learning, meeting other writers on a website called Scribophile, which is like an online writing and critique community. And it was just a really great place to kind of learn. And I had a lovely woman take me under her wing and basically coach me through my entire first novel until it was somewhat legible. From there, I found the WFWA, which is the Women's Fiction Writers Association, where I met a lot of other women who I've actually seen their careers grow. So that's been really cool. And people who really, in turn, offered to help me. And then perseverance. Like I said, The Things We Lost was my 7th book. I wrote consistently for about 10 years before that book came out. But I will also say there were, some years where I didn't write for 6 months, or I didn't touch it for an extended period of time. And I also acknowledge The Things We Lost is probably the first book that I really went back and didn't stop trying. Like a lot of my books, I did some editing, but then I put them away, or I did one draft and then I put them away. So it's really the first one that got that work in. But I say it to everyone: it's perseverance, it's persistence, and just knowing like you have it in you, but it does take time and work sometimes.
I don't. Nobody wants to hear that, right? Time
No.
and work. But you're kind of the proof that there can definitely be a payoff, which is awesome. So a few things stick out listening to that story. One, to run out of books. Oh my God, the horror! Like
Horror.
to be in another country.
Doesn't happen anymore. Have a Kindle now. That doesn't happen anymore.
Right, never again. But that's so amazing, that you had a friend, who challenged you to write something and she would read it and give you immediate feedback. I mean, that tends to work for people. Like that's how Frankenstein got written, a whole group of people challenged each other to write something, and now we have that classic. So that's kind of amazing. All right. So let me ask you, you did mention your first novel, The Things We Lost, which a lot of people consider women's fiction. So it's a bit outside of Twisted. I'm just wondering if you can talk about, breaking out of that classification, because it can be really difficult when everybody's telling you what you write, even if that's not how you see it yourself, because you've gone from that, to this book, which is actually really, really hard to categorize. I guess just suspense, that would work. Mystery would work. Thriller maybe. But can you talk about sort of breaking down those expectations that people have of you and how you get to be the writer you want to be versus the writer that people are telling you are for marketing purposes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I should preface The Things We Lost is a women's fiction, but it is a women's fiction with suspense. I do have a murder plot line in it as well. So it is definitely leaning more towards the thriller suspense side, but there is that emotional journey that is still a big thing. And we talk about it a lot with the Women's Fiction Writers Association, is the definition of women's fiction and where it kind of sits in the industry. And it's just such a broad genre, because you get romance in women's fiction, you can get fantasy in women's fiction, magic, history, and suspense thriller. So The Things We Lost is really, it's a what if story. It's about a woman who essentially makes a thoughtless wish and ends up 10 years back in time in an alternate past. And the really big thing is that all through her life, she's experienced this guilt because she had a friend who died in university under mysterious circumstances, and she's always felt like she was guilty for it. And now that she's gone back 10 years in time to this alternate past, this girl's alive 4 years after she should have died. So something about this plot line has changed, and it really circulates around, the mystery of this girl and her survival. And then my main character, she was married with kids in her old timeline, so she's also so desperate to get back to her children. So it was a very interesting book to write. I've always kind of felt like it's funny because I'm always like, oh, they're similar in like tone and that sort of thing, but they're really not. Like Twisted really is like a straight, police procedural crime thriller suspense book, whereas The Things We Lost is a lot more of an emotional read. So I think, it's one of those things where I do kind of feel like, for me, I am definitely moving more into the suspense thriller side of things, but I do find a lot of my work kind of teeters on the edge. So I always call it thrilling women's fiction. I do think it pigeonholes me a bit, but I also find people find a good story, and if they want to read it, they're going to read it no matter what it's called. So, I'm hoping it doesn't limit me very much, but I'm writing what I love, and I hope that just is what people enjoy.
Sure, sure. No, that's a fair point. And I always think, how unfortunate that there are, readers who may not read something that they think is women's fiction, because you can read something, incredibly similar by, Tess Gerritsen or Lisa Gardner, and that will be categorized differently, but it can be in a very similar vein. So I'm just, I'll read anything. So there's that. I'm like, I
I'm
like a
the
good
same,
story.
yeah.
I like a good book. I don't care who wrote it, what it's called. If it's a good story is a good story.
Exactly.
But let me ask you too. So you've mentioned the Women's Fiction Writers Association a few times. I know that you do social media for them. So you know a lot about marketing and promotion. And so I want to pick your mind for a moment, if you don't mind. But there are a lot of authors who are uncomfortable. I don't like to use the term selling themselves, but you got to push your own book. You want readers to discover your book, buy it, enjoy it, pass it on. So what would you say, to authors who struggle either with the technical components of what social media requires of them, or really in the more broader sense of just being their own advocate and getting out there and saying, hey, I have a book, would you consider reading it? Do you have any words of guidance for them and how they can come to this in a way that's comfortable?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of it is you just kind of have to believe in yourself and have a little bit of confidence. I know that's way easier said than done. But I mean, the reality is you wrote a freaking book. You should celebrate that. It doesn't matter what other people think, because you're not going to please everyone. So you just got to own that. I will honestly say I am an absolute roller coaster when it comes to how I feel. Some days I'm like, yeah, I'm amazing. I wrote these 2 books that are out there. And other days I'm like, why on earth are people reading these? Like, I am a nobody. So I totally get that. I say pick one platform and, get comfortable with that. If it's Instagram, if it's TikTok, if it's Facebook, if it's X or Threads, whatever it is, pick one and really focus there. I use Instagram. It's my preferred. I don't love TikTok. I just find it very overwhelming, and that might make me sound old, but it's just so busy. And I like Instagram because it does have that option of, if I feel like scrolling like you do on TikTok, I can with Reels. So it's really just you put all this work in, you were confident about this book that you wrote, like take that time and share that with the world. I definitely think a lot more about marketing now that I have books out. I have a friend who just did a beta read, and she had an extra point of view in her story, and we kind of suggested that she cut it, and it was tough. It was a tough call, and I know it was hard for her to do, but at the same time, I'm like, now you have this entire point of view that you don't need to incorporate into the story, but you have like a short story to market along with this story. And there's just all those things now that I'm thinking about. Like, one of the things I did with The Things We Lost, in an original draft, I wrote an epilogue for it. And we ended up pulling the epilogue from the final copy. So about a year later, I kind of told newsletter subscribers, I'm like, I'm going to share the unreleased epilogue with you, like if you're interested, and that sort of thing. So it's kind of just, it's weird to think about this thing that you work so hard on and put so much emotion into as like a marketable product. And I know I work in marketing, so it does make it a little easier for me to kind of pull back and analyze it that way. But yeah, it's always kind of thinking about, how can you share this and make it interesting? What is it about the book that made it interesting to you? That's what you need to go and tell your readers.
Sure. Thank you for that. I know it can be very difficult. And it's funny too, because even when you work in marketing, I think sometimes it's different when you're marketing somebody else's product versus your own. But I guess at least you have that perspective. And I love what you shared about, pulling that epilogue and then making it available anyway. That's brilliant, because then bonus content, like who doesn't love that?
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't think I would have thought about that. That's so great. So you've told us a lot, that really perseverance, persistence, keeping at it is very important. But I'm going to come back to the topic of advice, because everybody who sits here, I ask this particular question. So in terms of a creative life or a writing life, more specifically, what is the best advice that you were ever given? And it can be persistence or perseverance if that's what it is. But then the opposite side to that coin is, what is the best advice that you were never given and had to learn for yourself throughout the process of actually doing the hard work of writing?
Yeah, I think the best advice I was really given was especially when it came to pitching, was just because you put your book aside, you're querying, start your next book. The way that you wait on all of those submissions, because sometimes they take months, you distract yourself with your next book. And if that book doesn't do well, then you've already got something else to go forward with. Or if that book gets picked up 9 times out of 10, an agent or a publisher is going to ask you what is next. So have a what is next. And on the flip side of that, I would say the advice I was not ever really given, because I don't think there was an opportunity for it, but the advice I always give to everyone is, people think writing is a solitary activity. It is not. You need your community. You need your critique partners. You need other writers who understand what it's like to get a rejection, what it's like to win something, just people that are there for you to celebrate your wins, commiserate your losses, complain about this crazy industry for some reason that we all stick around and do a part of, and just your outlet, because it's so easy to get bogged down, to get negative on yourself. Your mental health can suffer, and just having that community and those people that back you, 1, to read your work when you need it, 2, to support you when you need it. It's honestly like the best thing that I've ever had. And I will say the advice was not given to me, but it was something that, especially with Scribophile and WFWA, were 2 huge places where I grew my communities.
That's great advice. Thanks for sharing that. It's funny because not a lot of people, say that specifically, but it's so true. I mean, a lot of writing is solitary, but not all of it. And you really do need those people who can relate to what you've been through, because publishing is like one of those really weird worlds where if you haven't experienced it, like, you just can't appreciate what people are telling you about it, because it's its own kind of torture, but its own kind of thrill. Like, you can't get off the coaster, but if people haven't been on the coaster, they can't really get it. So excellent advice there. And there's such a supportive community for writers, which is amazing. So go find those people. All right, so I have to ask you, and this ought to be a real challenging question. It's also the final question, so I can let you back to life and writing. But we've talked a bit about Twisted in a sort of a very vague way, and you mentioned that there will be another book coming out next year called Wicked, and it is a continuation story. We can say that without spoiling anything, but now I have to wait, so I need you to tell me at least a little bit, what can we expect next without spoiling anything? There's a gauntlet thrown, right?
So I think you'll like this. You are going to get Blaine's point of view.
All right. I do like that.
It is 3 points of view as well. So Twisted follows 3 points of view, which is Ryan, Mel, and Brielle. And I have 3 new points of view in Wicked. Blaine, who was a background character in Twisted, now gets his own point of view. And Ryan is in Wicked, but he is actually now in the background of a new point of view. And her name is Cora, and she works in forensics for the Ottawa Police Department. So the book takes you to a new city where Ryan is picking up after what happened at the end of Twisted, which no spoilies, and where Blaine is as well. So it really does follow the story about the drug more. You go into sort of a little bit more of what exactly happened and where this drug came from. And a little bit more of the conspiracies behind it. So I'm very excited. It was a ton of fun to write. And I just finished my latest round of edits on it. So hopefully everybody enjoys it.
Oh man, I am so there for it. I love that we get new perspectives, but it's still a continuation story. And I think I just got a lot more out of you than I expected, but like, I am, all right, I'm ready. I'm waiting. In the meantime, everybody else has to go pick up Twisted because it is available right now. I guarantee it's unlike anything you've read recently. Dare I say it's a wicked good read. So Maggie Giles, thank you so much. What a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It was so great chatting with you.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.